Okay, we did this sort of thing maybe about 5 or 6 weeks ago, a big review class, and I had a section on discussing themes and applying those themes to our walk with the Lord. And of course, we ran out of time and didn't really get to do that. So I'm trying to protect that time at the end of this class to have a discussion about the themes so far in Ezekiel, and make that a bigger part of this review class period. So let's jump in. We are going to talk first about the outline of the book of Ezekiel and the major sections and historical events that are mentioned in the book. We want to do some, not every chapter, you'll thank me for that maybe, but some key chapters or sections of Ezekiel, matching them up with what's going on in those chapters or a highlight from that chapter, and then, as I said, connect the important themes of Ezekiel to our relationship with God. So, the way this will go is I'll give you time to work with those around you, and then I'll stop you, we'll share out, and we'll alternate back and forth through each of the sections of your handout. And if you didn't get a handout, raise your hand. They still have them in the back. So it looks like Stephen over here needs one. So make sure you have one of those. Okay, work on for 2 or 3 minutes the structure and content of Ezekiel, the very first section, with the various boxes and filling in the blanks there. So work on that with a neighbor for 2 minutes, and then we'll share out in just a second. We're just doing the first section for now. We're not on to chapter 1 to 11 yet. So. Well, then let's go. All right, so let's stop and let's do the historical context and the structure of the book. So the gray boxes at the top on the screen are the 3 events that happened in Jerusalem over the course of Ezekiel writing the book, roughly. And then we'll alternate. The first longer column is the sections of Ezekiel. So the first historical event, technically it doesn't happen in the book of Ezekiel, but it's referenced the opening of Ezekiel. And what is that? Jerusalem is bowed. Okay, we've used B words, so I don't know if that's helpful or not. But what does that mean, by the way, that Jerusalem was bowed? What event are we referring to? And which king is that was taken away, Robert? Chin, that's right. Jehoiachin was dethroned by Nebuchadnezzar, and many exiles, including Ezekiel, are taken into captivity. 5 years later, Ezekiel begins writing his book when God appears to him. So then we move down to Ezekiel 1 to 24. The first section of the book, the first 24 chapters, are about what coming on Jerusalem? Judgment coming on Jerusalem. So things are bad, but God isn't finished yet. They're going to get worse. As we saw recently, chapter 24, verse 1, so up to the next gray box, what happens in chapter 24, verse 1? Jerusalem is besieged. Okay, that's actually the one B word that fits with the word in the text. Jerusalem is besieged by Nebuchadnezzar. So at that point, from 25 to 32, Ezekiel is going to be talking about judgment on whom? The nations. So there's a shift of focus, an interlude, as the nations are addressed. And then we're going to hear in chapter 33, verse 21, that Jerusalem has been broken is the B word. And what do we mean by that? Totally destroyed by the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar. And at that point, the rest of the book, chapter 34, really, 33 to 48, is about hope. After the destruction, then there's a message of hope for the future. Okay? And then thematically, one way you could break it down into 2 major themes in the book of Ezekiel is that in chapter 10, verse 18, the text says that the glory of the Lord did what? Departed from the temple, from Jerusalem. And we're going to read in chapter 43, verse 5, that in a picture of the future, the glory of the Lord does what? Returns. It comes back. Came into this new Jerusalem. Okay, so that's the structure of Ezekiel, the outline of the book, kind of framed in an interesting way by the 3 historical events of the captivity and destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, let's move on. So chapter 1 to 11 will kind of do briefly here. There's 3 major sections, and then there's 3 or so questions that we talked about. So spend 3 or 4 minutes with your partner or a group going over the 3 matching sections of Ezekiel 1 to 11 and the 3 learning objectives, questions to answer there. Do that, and we'll share out in maybe 4 minutes. Okay, let's go ahead and go over just chapters 1 to 11 and the 3 sections of matching. Chapters 1 to 3, which is that? Yeah, the prophet is not always called first thing in the book, like in the book of Isaiah, but oftentimes the call is the first thing. So Ezekiel's first experience is to see God's glory and called as a watchman in Israel. More on that in a second. Then in chapters 4 to 7, the sign acts, including the model of Jerusalem that he builds a siege around. These are not all the sign acts in the book of Ezekiel, but there does seem to be a concentration of them. Kind of early on, he's called and immediately given several weird things to act out or perform in front of the people in chapters 4 to 7. Okay? And then in chapters 8 to 11, he sees the vision. And all of that is one vision of idolatry in the temple in chapter 8, and then chapter 9, the slaughter of the people in Jerusalem, as well as God's glory leaving, the cloud departing the temple, and then Jerusalem in chapters 9, 10, and 11. Okay? So then, questions here. And we do have a microphone to share out if some of these are longer answers. What is a watchman? Who wants to try to explain the concept of a watchman and what it represents really for Ezekiel? Ian, go ahead.
I kind of thought of it as like a watchman in a watchtower, surrounding the walls of a city. Their job is to see incoming danger and make people aware of that. So I see Ezekiel as he's aware of what the coming danger is, the pending doom, and he's telling them before it gets there.
That's right. And is it the watchman's job to save all the people? Get them out of the city? No, it's just to warn. If he's warned the people, he's done his job. You have one job, right? That's the watchman's job, to warn the people of danger. Okay? All right, second question. We're guessing here a little bit, but what are some reasons why God might have had Ezekiel do these weird things like chop up hair with a sword and build a model city and lie on his side and eat weird bread baked over dung? What are some possible reasons of the sign act? Brian and then Brian.
It seemed that God wanted to catch their attention and that they couldn't overlook these bizarre behaviors, but it breaks through the clutter.
Okay.
And gets their attention.
Gets their attention. And Brian?
It does raise attention, but we're talking about it. It's also raising awareness. It's probably also showing more of the sincerity and intensity that God wants Ezekiel to portray to the people of Jerusalem. Is that, look, you better really pay attention. This is serious. I'm acting crazy because it's going to get crazy.
You probably have had a different emotional experience viewing a Shakespeare play as opposed to reading the text. Right? So maybe some of that is built into what Brian's saying. And there is an attention grabbing. I'll offer you one kind of slightly different explanation, especially because we know the people aren't going to listen to Ezekiel. God tells them that up front. They're a rebellious house. They won't listen. Is it possible that the sign acts are like the parables, a way to present the message that will actually conceal its true meaning from a group of people that have a hardened heart and are just looking for any excuse to say, oh, Ezekiel's just a weirdo, I'm not going to pay any attention to him? We've actually seen some evidence of that when they say, oh, he's just talking in parables, right? So it's just maybe a way to conceal the message so those who have a hardened heart would easily reject it. Those who have ears to hear, let them hear. And then finally, the third one, we can do this quickly. What was the sin? This is in chapter 8. Added on top of the idolatry in the temple, as if that wasn't bad enough. Violence in the city, bloodshed in the city, another major theme. Okay, Yeah, Albert.
What Ezekiel had to do were physical, emotional, and challenging, and as we just recently read, the loss of his wife. So this was not an easy task. It'd be like, okay, prophet, you haven't suffered anything. I mean, that's obviously been removed.
Yeah, makes it a very personal experience for Ezekiel reading his book, which he's writing in the first person, which is also unique in the prophets. Okay, work on 12 to 24. There are more chapters here, and then 4 objective questions. So spend maybe 7 or 8 minutes on that, and then we'll go over 12 to 24 in just a minute. Okay, let's go over these. Again, I'm kind of rushing a little bit to make sure we have time at the end for a discussion of application from the book so far. I've labeled this on your worksheet, chapters 12 to 24, parables and prosecution. So, as you know, it made me very happy that I could get 2 words with the same letter. But there really is almost an alternation. You know, every other chapter or so, a weird story or a fable or a parable or an allegory that is representative of something going on with Jerusalem or with Israel. And then chapters where it's just an argument that's being made. It's laying out, you know, the history of Israel, or, you know, the kind of logic behind who's accountable for sin and why. And so kind of going back and forth in this legal prosecution, and then the parables or allegories that God is having Ezekiel tell as well. Because of that, it's kind of a hard section to keep straight, right? Especially when like all of the parables have something to do with a vine or an eagle or a lion, which is which, or all of the above. Okay. What did you say? Yeah, that's right. So chapter 14 is one of our prosecution sections, and what is the highlight there? It's in I know. I was literally just about to say, I hope I got these letters right, because I'm going back and forth between the handout and the PowerPoint. And, you know, I double checked, but I didn't triple check. E is the correct answer. I was testing you. Don't believe everything a teacher says, you know. Okay, yes. Not even Noah, Daniel, and Job could deliver Judah. Chapter 15 is a parable section. That one is correct. Jerusalem is a useless vine, not bearing fruit, will be burned up. Chapter 16, another story. Yeah, D, Jerusalem is the wife that is turned into a harlot, sold herself to others. Chapter 17 is another parable. H, 2 eagles and a vine, representing the rebellion against the first eagle, who represents, this is too much to ask you this, the 2 eagles. First eagle was Babylon, and they rejected the first eagle and turned to the second eagle, who was Egypt, and that's not going to turn out well for Zedekiah or the people. Chapter 18, an argument. K, the soul who sins will die. We'll come back to that one in a second. Chapter 20, so skipping to chapter 20, another argument. Hopefully G, and that is correct. Just look at your history, Israel. From Egypt all the way through, you have rebelled in the same way against God, and I've almost destroyed you all those times, but decided against it. Chapter 23, another allegory. J, the 2 promiscuous sisters, very similar to chapter 16, but now Samaria and Jerusalem, both described. A little bit of different angle. And then chapter 24, a parable of the defiled pot, burned and melted by God. Okay? All right, then our objective questions here. So from chapter 18, the proverb going around. Let's get a microphone and someone can help explain this for us. The fathers eat the sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. What does that proverb mean, and how is it being used by the people? Who wants to take a crack at that for us? We'll do Mike here because Brian's.
This is taking a stab, but wasn't this what it was talking about? Like whether children were being punished for the sins of their fathers? And yeah,
Yep.
it's not that, it's your own fault.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's why the matching statement from God is, no, the soul who sins will die. Okay. But yes, the sour grapes thing is all this terrible stuff going on, it's because of dad or granddad. The previous generations have sinned, and now, well, we didn't do anything. But no, the soul who sins will die. Thank you, Mike. From chapter 21, the sword imagery, the glittering, polished sword. Who is that historically? Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is the sword coming against. He's the tool of God's judgment, but he's the sword coming against Jerusalem. From the next chapter, chapter 22, and again, an explanation here if someone wants to take a stab at it, like Mike did successfully. Chapter 22, God says he was looking and found no one who would stand in the gap. What does that mean? Brian?
When you look at a gap in terms of defenses, that's a weakness where you're vulnerable. In this instance, I think God's saying there's not a righteous man here to stand in the gap to bring salvation upon Jerusalem.
So there's a weakness, there's a missing hold, something needed, no one righteous to stand up and do what needs to be done. But there is a specific element of this that we talked about in class. See if anybody... And what about Moses, Patty? Yes, remember the connection here is in Psalm 106, verse 23, which uses the same language. It said that Moses, when God was ready to destroy Israel and obliterate them, Moses stood in the gap. And as Patty explained, the way he did that was by interceding for the people, pleading with God, no, please don't destroy them. And so I think along with the general principle of there's just no one righteous to stand up and do what needs to be done, maybe more specifically, God is saying there is no one currently in Ezekiel's time to stand up and plead for Jerusalem and to intercede like Moses or maybe like Abraham back in the day for Sodom and Gomorrah to plead for the wicked city. So his wrath is not going to be held back. It's going to come on the city. Robert?
Yeah, and I just keep thinking that maybe it's not only that, but it's also all the excuses that would have been justification for God to say, I'm going to let them be saved, are all completely gone. There's not only are there no one to do it, but there's nothing left to defend.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. All right, thank you, Robert. And then last one here, what did God ask in chapter 24 Ezekiel to do related to his wife? Not mourn her death. We can't explain what that meant, but what was the point of it? What was the connection from Ezekiel's little sign act, Albert's point, very difficult sign act, this one, to endure the death of his wife without mourning publicly? What was the point, Justin?
It was the example for how the people were to not mourn for the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem.
Yeah, and we actually, it was helpful for me because it presented different possibilities. We talked about whether this is a command, you do not mourn the temple when it's destroyed, or whether it's just a statement of reality, that once this happens, you're going to be so shell-shocked, everything's going to be so in upheaval, or you yourself are going to be swept away in the judgment. There is not going to be any period of mourning. Everything's just going to be undone. Whether it's one of those two, it does become a sign for what will happen when Jerusalem is destroyed. That's right, yeah. And so the destruction for the people will be oh, wow, yes, God was right all along. Yeah, it could be that as well. Yeah. All right, we did pretty well. A few minutes behind what I wanted, but we still have about 12 minutes or 13 minutes to do application. So this is what I really want you to discuss in groups. I think that'll be really profitable, to spend time in your groups talking about what have you learned for yourself from the book of Ezekiel so far. What stood out to you? What big ideas, what themes, and how have those themes, those big ideas from Ezekiel, helped you to understand the nature of God, understand your responsibility to God, understand God's whatever, or understand your responsibility as a Christian? Any of those things are fair game, so discuss in your groups what Ezekiel has meant to you so far, and the major themes that have stood out. Give you about 5 minutes to do that. Okay, I won't say all that again. About 8 minutes here. So we've done this before. Why don't you share out, somebody share out, we'll bring the microphone to you, something valuable that someone else said in your discussion. So share with us something that you heard in your discussion you felt like was worth sharing or helped you. We talk about the major themes so far in Ezekiel and what they mean for us today. Brian, what did you hear from someone else in your group that was helpful?
A lot, quite a bit. Quite frankly, just to kick it off, God's word is truth, and He's speaking to us, and that's they didn't believe God in the days of Ezekiel. The false prophets were telling them, you can build your houses now, and the judgment is a long ways off, and when it comes, it'll be brief. And God said, no, I've told you. And so what I see here and what we were talking about is God means what He says and says what He means, and He hates sin and will hold us accountable for the sins, and that happens both physically and spiritually. However, with destruction that comes upon us physically in sin, there's still hope, salvation, that we repent.
Okay, God's word is true, and we're accountable to that same word. Thank you, Brian, and Brian's group. Other valuable things that came out of your discussion to share with the whole class. Marty?
Well, Beth said, looking at chapter 16 is that you have to be struck with how people can get lower and lower, farther from God, more captivated by their sin and not maybe realize the depths that they go to. And adding to that a little bit, intergenerationally, that's easy too, because maybe you're not doing anything much worse than your parents did. And you think, well, I haven't added much to that, but it's just as bad. And so I think from one generation to the next, that same decline. But the main point that I think she was making was, and you don't even realize how deep and far away, deep in sin and far away from God.
The slide of people downward, of all of us, you get to a point you don't even realize how far you've come. Perhaps because of the incremental changes, or perhaps because we're really good at deceiving ourselves. Chapter 16 was the one mentioned, very clearly shows us our state, in case we're confused about that. Thank you. Ian?
Nobody said this in our group, but that just made me think, what Beth said made me think of something that, sin is really this extremely slippery slope. And the way Israel started out was they were wanting what the rest of the world had. They wanted a king. It's that small little desire to be like the world that led to this destruction. It was just like the butterfly effect of generation after generation justifying what their parents did, like Marty said, and their parents did. And it just got worse and worse and worse. And so I think that's a lesson for us to take, that we really have to understand the devastating effect of sin, not just on ourselves, but on our children and our children's children, because naturally we just want to be like our fathers or our mothers, and we inherit kind of their habits in different ways, and so that can have bad repercussions. On the opposite side of the spectrum, though, if our parents are doing the right things and generations before them are doing the right things, then the light will grow and the darkness will not be there.
The horrors of sin, man, you could think of half a dozen images from the first half of Ezekiel that just show, in ways that make you wince, because you don't actually want to read those words in the Bible, especially out loud, how gross, how shameful our sin is. We've hopefully been reminded of that. Raises the stakes quite a bit, hopefully. Other thoughts on the first half of Ezekiel? Albert? Everyone's looking at you now.
Something just popped into me is my faith, is my hope based on numbers of Christians that I know? Is it based on the success of the church and the numbers and the strength, or is my hope and faith built on God will come again and I'm his child? It just, you saw so many. I want to be a remnant. I want to strive, and regardless of what my circumstances are in, or the health or wealth and stability of the numbers, that's not what my faith or my hope is dependent upon, but the solid word, the promise, the complete word that I have known, and I just have to keep reminding myself of that and not get discouraged, frantic, or panic based on what's going on in this world.
Thank you, Albert. Where was the confidence of the people in Jerusalem? What were they banking on being the reason why they would be okay? That's exactly what Albert was talking. I thought about that. We're the meat in the pot. The pot being Jerusalem. We're safe here. It's home base, right? To Albert's point, I wonder if we think that way about the local church we're a part of, the greater Church of Christ concept. It's like, I'm in the pot, man. Nothing's going to happen to me here. But as Albert said, that's just a way of deceiving ourselves. It's about our own obedience and trust in the Lord. Yes, ma'am.
You just said what I was going to say.
I'm so sorry. Say what you were going to say. It's probably going to be better.
That nothing bad is going to happen to us. And Mr. Brian, I was going to cheat and let him finish.
Okay. Brian, you want to, this is part of y'all's discussion?
Well, I heard that Leah had something to say from what Anita said, because she heard it from Beth. It came from your mouth because your dad whispered it to you.
Thank you, Brian. I believe I deserve that. Yes, Dustin.
So one of the themes that sticks out to me here is kind of God is looking for someone to stand in the gap. When you look at the call of Ezekiel initially, when you look at the recalling of people like Moses and Job, and all of the discussions that God's having through Ezekiel about, well, the leaders of Israel are doing this, and the individuals are doing this, and the specific call-outs to the people who should have taken a role and should have stood up and said something and tried to do something for God that didn't. I think that's a lesson for us. God is looking to us individually to not just play it off on somebody else. Well, it's somebody else's responsibility to stand in the gap for God. And it may be in our church life, and it may be in our individual life, it may be in our work life. But we need to be cognizant of the calling that we have as Christians to stand in the gap and stand up for what we're supposed to when the situation calls for it.
Thank you, Dustin. And we'll end on that because people are crowding the foyer. We're going to move into the interlude of Ezekiel. So we'll spend some time Wednesday talking about this next section of Ezekiel, what it's all about, and then we'll just get through chapter 25, which shouldn't take too long. So be reading chapters 25 to 32, the judgment on the nations, and we'll reconvene Wednesday. Thank you guys so much for your good work today.